So, Minister, we survived the storm with the three ratings agencies. How much footwork had to be done behind the scenes? I know you were meeting with them. You were traveling abroad to be able to engage with them. But I would imagine that you had to walk a tightrope to be able to give them assurances that there is a level of stability, that their concerns about our economy are addressed, and that their particular concerns about our political situation is not going to backfire the situation is not going to backfire anytime soon. So to build up that confidence, to be able to give them those kinds of assurances, I would imagine it was really an egg dance for you.
Can you imagine me doing an egg dance? Yes and no. No in the sense that what I said earlier in the remarks that I made, I believe in. We have many good things going for South Africa. And if you believe in it, you can sell it. If you don't believe in it, then you're in trouble. You better change. I better not say that. So that's the first point. The second is that if we're looking purely at what they call the fiscal metrics, we stand on good ground. And one of the good decisions that government made, and I think we must be careful when we look at these issues. No finance minister or treasury can just go off on their own and say, this is the way the budget is going to look like. We take all of our numbers, have them thoroughly debated in cabinet, and what we present on budget day is a decision of the cabinet as a whole. And so cabinet made the bold choice of saying, we're going to, by the third year of the medium-term expenditure framework, have a deficit of 2.4%. And for those of you that are interested, have a primary surplus in the third year as well, which means that by the third year, if you take everything else out of the equation, revenue must be greater than expenditure. So we're not borrowing for consumption purposes. And that was a bold decision to make. We had to find money for the zero increase in university fees, for example. We had to find money for subscription to the new development stroke BRICS Bank as well, and a few other areas also. And there was a careful balancing between money derived from tax measures and money derived from expenditure cuts without damaging growth, because that's the other, if you like, egg dance that we've got to undertake. Secondly, the issue of business confidence. And this is where, I mean, all sectors of our economy realize that they're all going to have a negative impact on themselves if they don't work with us. But more importantly, you had leadership coming from those sectors who were far-sighted, who understood that this was a moment which required a different measure of solidarity and collective work, as displayed in the roadshow that I've talked about, in the way in which ratings agencies were engaged with. They were engaged with in London, they were engaged with in Washington during the spring meetings of the IMF and World Bank, and finally when they visited South Africa as well. And for the first time, we actually probably had the widest spectrum of people meeting the ratings agencies so that all of us can have a say and honestly answer whether we have confidence in our economy and society or we don't. I wasn't there for all of those sessions, but clearly the outcome was a positive one. The third thing is something that we heard throughout this period, and which you've probably heard me say in one or other place, which is that the investors that we attract to buy our bonds and equities in South Africa, and indeed the ratings agencies as well, don't want to hear your plans anymore. So don't refer to the National Development Plan. All they want to know, and these were questions that we were confronted with in very straightforward terms, what are the milestones that we have to watch for X particular activity, and we will then measure you by whether you're actually achieving those milestones or not. And so that's some of the work that we've now got to do over the next few months. On the politics, let's be frank, both with yourselves and with them, which is that this interaction between politics and economics and the perceptions of a country arising from this interaction is not unique to us. Look at Brazil and what is happening there. or look at the trumpet players, or look at Brexit and what's happening in the Conservative Party at the moment, look at what migration is doing to Europe, but similarly elsewhere in the world as well. So this interaction is not always a neat and clinical one, and we have our fair share of what we call political noise. And in particular, we had to explain that we're now leading up to a local government election, which would mean sharper contestation, and I'm sure you would have seen some of it today here, and the kind of rhetoric that's going to emerge from that contestation might create concerns for an outsider. And of course, equally frankly, we have to tell you that people asked me, what about your job? So I say, I'm here, I've been given a job to do, and I will continue to do it. They believed me, so it's good.
Okay, Minister, your message just now was don't be too depressed. But it's difficult not to be depressed and really worried. We've just had figures released this week about the negative growth, the trade figures. We're staring down the barrel of another gun, not Mr. Malema's gun, but an Afghan, with the possibility of a recession hanging over us. So on top of all this, our country is really volatile. You have constant sets of protests, you have schools being burnt down, you have students who have had to resort to abandoning their class to stand up for their issues. You have issues of race hanging over us. Now, you then have to go out to the rest of the world and say, despite all of this happening, we're still okay. We're still a stable nation. We have our problems. And I get that you're saying that it's not unique to South Africa, that this is the story of the world we live in. But the thing about South Africa is that we seem to be sabotaging ourselves almost, particularly with our politics.
These guys look like fairly decent South Africans, yeah? So I represent them. So yes, no, we are a nation in making. We are a country in making. We are an economy in making. So we need to collectively, as parents, as members of civil society, as government, as political parties, and other formations, just as ordinary citizens, say to those young people who think burning a school, and they're not burning it of their own accord, they're being inspired to do so. So if you really go into some of those issues, for example, in the north of the country, you'll find that the burning of schools has as an underlying factor the retention of economic benefits that have been derived as a result of a particular configuration of municipal boundaries in that area. Dig a little bit deeper and ask the question, who's been getting tenders in this area, right? And then you'll begin to understand why the reconfiguration of those boundaries might be impacting on certain economic interests. And we've faced this in my previous job in cooperative governance from one part of the community. This time there was the other part of the community. But we need to send a collective message, as Minister Nzimande has yesterday and reported this morning, that burning, breaking, looting, stealing, and destroying is not a formula for going forward. For university students to actually do that, when there's an active process of dialogue going on. For example, this morning with my Treasury colleagues, we were looking at where do we find more money so that we can manage this 0% increase over a longer period of time. Where do we find money to build university accommodation? Now, if you're burning the same accommodation that is being built for you, then you say we don't have accommodation, which means we have to find hundreds of millions of rands, if not billions, to pay for the same thing that you've actually destroyed. That's madness. And so we need a louder voice of various types of authority to be expressed in a very clear way that this is not how we want to run South Africa, that there are other ways of solving problems, and you do have a government that listens. There might be parts that doesn't work or might not be as responsive as they need to be, but on these sorts of issues, you have a responsive government, and we've demonstrated that in practice. But there are some who have an agenda of disruption and who believe that greater benefit can accrue to them politically or otherwise if negative means are used, if populist rhetoric is actually utilized, and you can see what populism is doing in different parts of the world. You don't want that wrong type of populism in South Africa. For example, whatever color T-shirt you like, if you go out there and you actually tell young people, march with me and I'll give you jobs, you're lying to them. Because only X amount of jobs are created in the public sector, 30%. Right? Most of the jobs are created by the 70% of the economy, the private sector. And unless you grow that sector in all its different forms, from an informal trader to a multi-billionaire, and a multi-billionaire who can share and create more dynamism in the economy, we're not going to solve the problem of unemployment. If we don't give those young people training and really intensify and multiply the efforts that should be going into that area, like Germany did at a particular point in time, or other parts of Europe as well, with which training those young people can actually learn a skill, get a job, or start a small business, or do some kind of work that will engage them in the economy, then we are creating a serious level of hopelessness that will be capitalized on by the wrong kind of approach to politics at the end of the day. So you can get short-term benefits by mobilizing on this basis, particularly leading up to the 3rd of August. It doesn't solve any problems at the end of the day. For many of us, the issue is how do you bring about structural changes that will create effectively a different trajectory in the lives of many of the people who live in desperation and hopelessness at this point in time. We don't claim to have all the answers, and that's why our focus is on building consensus, building unity, and mobilizing all the resources that are available in our society, and be very creative as a community of communities, if you like, if we can mobilize them all together and direct them in the right way.
Okay, so since you were reappointed as Finance Minister, hopeful South Africans would like to believe that the economy is in a safe pair of hands, that you are doing your level best to stabilize things, to achieve your targets, especially when it comes to fiscal consolidation. But I think that the question that keeps many people up at night is how much political support you have. We've asked you this question before on the day of the budget.
Why are you asking it again?
Because there are things that have happened in between then and now. And therefore, we have to ask it again. We all want desperately to believe that you have political support because our economic growth, the value of our rand, our plans for development, all rests on this, on you getting the necessary support, both from your cabinet colleagues and from the ANC, the party that deployed you into this position. Do you have that support?
I'm still in the job. And I think next week I'll be in the job as well. So, no, but more seriously, I know it's a legitimate question given the events that we've had over the past few months, and in particular in December. But I think there are times when we've got to put all of that aside and focus on the job at hand, which is what we're trying to do, both as Treasury and as the various departments that impact upon the economy. And both the ANC and the presidency have issued statements, which is unusual, saying that they give us their support and goodwill. And above all, we get lots of positive support from the public as well, because that's the public that we serve, apart from the political parties that we serve as well. So we are here, we're here to serve, we'll do our best, and we will continue to appeal until you get absolutely tired that we need everybody's help to create a different South Africa. And we're getting it increasingly.
Okay, so you were talking about negative noises and the impact that it has. And there is a lot of noise in South Africa generally. But I was listening, for example, to an interview by your cabinet colleague, Lindiwe Zulu, the Minister of Small Business, where she was saying that when you prepare your budget, you should remember that this is not England. This is a developmental state. So, you know, it's statements like that that make us worry. That surely when you sit in cabinet and you, as you said now, that it's a cabinet effort to plan budgets, surely there is consensus among you about what priorities there are. So why would somebody sitting in that room come out and warn you that this is not England and have to remind you? Surely you don't need reminding that this is a developmental state?
Yeah, I forgot to bring my top hat. How many of you here work in a finance capacity or in a CFO office? If you don't mind raising your hand. Not enough. You, too few. But ask any CFO, whether in a government context or in a private sector context, the bids for budget allocations will always be 20, 30, 40% more than the money available, whether you're inside government or you're outside government. And Minister Zulu's concern is a very understandable one, because one of the areas, as you heard me pointing out, that we need to grow very substantially, given the character and the structure of our economy, is the small business sector. So we're in touch with her and engaging further to see, even within our constrained envelope, as we go forward into the next budget cycle, what is it that we can do to ensure that we synergize the many resources that we have in the country to get better outcomes and support for small businesses.
Another area where the issue of political support becomes crucial is fiscal consolidation, the issue of haircuts, which I know it's a term you particularly like, your ability to stabilize debt and cut the wage bill. All of that requires substantial political support. And it doesn't seem as if everybody is on the same page, because you still have instances where people are living in hotels. We've had a case recently where it was reported that one of your cabinet colleagues is staying in a five-star hotel. You still have big amounts of money being spent on the cars of the First Lady. So the kind of thing that you were saying in your first term already, about cutting the fat and tightening belts, it's still not penetrating where it should be.
Yeah, but I think we must be careful not to use a couple of incidents and then generalize on that basis. I know the media loves that because that sells. But more generally, if you look at the period 2010 up to now, we've made huge progress. Take the area of procurement. Where we now have a central procurement office. That sometimes frustrates people, because we're actually taking away opportunities for patronage. But look at the pluses. Take school book packs, for example. Last year, each pack cost some 460 rands, and you can multiply that by hundreds of thousands. And as a result of centralized procurement and negotiations between ourselves and the Basic Education Department and vendors, that cost of 460 came down to about 130. All right, that's billions of rands that has been saved. The instance which actually gave rise to what we call transversal procurement being scaled up for many other areas was the ARVs, where provinces were doing their own thing, so to speak. Once we centralized that with the Department of Health, they now manage this. We probably save somewhere between 2 and 3.5 billion rands a year as a result of centralized procurement. Now, there's about 100 areas in which that kind of procurement is actually taking place. We are now negotiating travel deals, hotel deals, et cetera, et cetera. So the Central Procurement Office has to save, I think it's 25 billion rands over the next 3 years through these sorts of measures. So there might be aberrations from time to time, but if you look at the trend, we're heading in the right direction, we're getting results. It might not please everyone, but by and large, the 1.3 million civil servants and all the politicians that are in the system are learning to live with it.
Yes, but Minister, in order for us to traverse these difficult times that you said that we are in, there needs to be strong messages from government frowning upon instances where there is wanton spending, where the messages you send out about belt tightening is infringed. But we don't get that kind of message from government that this is not tolerable.
No, money and any other issue is a constant struggle. So you're going to have many tugs of war, if you like, in each of these areas. The message is clear, and most of government has been repeating it. As I said, you will get aberrations from time to time. Most of you work in the private sector. Ask yourselves whether it is within the Daily Maverick or elsewhere, whether everything works perfectly, everyone sticks to the rules. From time to time, you're going to get people who go out and do their own thing. So try and understand that as a minority phenomenon. But if we're making progress in terms of the broad direction and the thrust of what we want to do, then we are satisfied that we're beginning to move in the right kind of direction. And the public must make as much noise as possible to hold us accountable, because that's what democracy is about. Hold us accountable where we make mistakes. I was going to say clap us, but that sounds a bit impolite. But reprimand us for where we make mistakes as well, and ensure that the dynamism that should be working within a democratic system actually operates. And accountability and the fear of exposure, inverted commas, is what keeps these sorts of systems alive at the end of the day. If you as the public go to sleep, and if the media goes to sleep, then others will have fun. Now that applies to corporate executives, by the way, or to governments as well. So that's where you get the concept of shareholder activism within a company context, and where every now and again you'll get challenges, for example, in respect of the remuneration that is awarded to CEOs and to others, or group executives, or a group of executives within the private sector as well. And those are the checks and balances that should work within a democratic environment.
Minister, during your first term as finance minister, I think it was December 2013, before the election, there was an interview you did where you said you would like to do something else, that you had consulted your family. We have some of them here, and we're very happy to have them. And your message was that, that you would like to serve the country in another capacity, which you then did. Over the past few months, now that you've taken this position again, did you go through periods where you regretted taking this position again? I would imagine that the strain that was there in December 2013 that prompted you to make those statements is a million times worse now.
No, that wasn't about strain. That was just about getting philosophical in old age, older age, and reflecting a bit and say, well, I've had 40-odd years of activism and public service of one kind or another. Is there something else that I would like to do? And my family will be very happy if I say, yes, there's something else I would like to do. Because running around every other day to meetings and being accountable to you here, it makes life tough. But it's part of what we have to do as Democrats in a system. The last few months, they've been difficult in many different ways. But far more importantly, it's been an opportunity to contribute to building a different narrative, to building a coalition of positive South Africans who want to do positive things for the country, share their resources, share their skills, share their wisdom, so that we can make a real difference to South Africa. And what we've achieved, for example, just in the limited term with the ratings agencies, is fantastic feedback for that kind of team effort. And as far as I know, all of us are committed to now go through the next 6 months and see if we could win South Africa another 18 months of peace, so that we can go on to tackle some of the economic challenges that I've actually outlined as well. So we come from reasonably tough stock as activists that have grown up in difficult times in the 70s and 80s, and that helps a hell of a lot to both manage difficulties on the one hand, but continue to remain optimistic about the prospects ahead of us and look for constant opportunities to achieve more positive things as we go forward.
Yes, but at that time, during your first term, there were pressures on issues like radical economic transformation. That was the catchphrase then, and people were wanting to see that manifest in the budget. And it was difficult for you to do. It's still difficult to be able to meet political targets when we are in a constrained economy. And on top of everything else that you're juggling, with the global economic situation, with the volatility of the currency, I would imagine that these political pressures are extremely difficult to bear.
Well, economic change and transformation is never going to be easy. So what you rely on is not just operating as an individual, but rely on, for example, a really excellent team of professionals at the Treasury. For example, the Director General, Mr. Fuzile, could have walked off the other day after having spent almost 18 to 20 years in the public service, and he still agreed to a 2-year extension to his contract. Now, here's a group of professionals who could make a lot of money elsewhere, but are very committed to serving the public and ensuring that we continue to build strong institutions and make a difference on the economic front. And secondly, you work as a team of ministers. Thirdly, you work as a team of social partners. And even compared to 2013, the current discourse is one that reflects a lot better understanding of what kind of structural changes are required, that you can't get those changes at the click of a finger or fingers, that it's going to be hard work, that you've got to build coalitions when you want that kind of change. And as I pointed out earlier on, reforms are more easily spoken about than actually done. And I think we're getting to the point where on the political front and on the economic and trade union front and more generally in civil society, we might well be reaching a point of convergence in terms of understanding what are the things we need to tackle, how do we go about tackling them, but more importantly, engage in practical activity that demonstrates that we can bring about change and see whether it works or not. The one thing that's worth repeating 1,000,000 times is that there's no textbook on these things. If there was a textbook for how to get to 10% growth, there's no reason to sit at minus 1.2, am I right? All of us will be at 10%. It's a piece of cake. So growing an economy is obviously far more complex. Managing the politics of growing an economy and transforming it as well has no textbooks also. So the only thing that will teach us is 2 things. 1, collective purpose and will, and 2, actually doing the job, and then learning lessons from doing the job, either confirming that certain things are being done the right way, or learning that you've made mistakes and you need to try other ways of bringing about change.
Okay, now precisely on that point of doing things the right way, you made certain undertakings in the budget on issues like SAA. You said there would be a new board appointed. On SARS, you said the issues there would be sorted out within a few weeks.
I thought you were going to give me an easy time this afternoon.
So sorry. But it seems you say one thing, and although there's a certain level of confidence that you have political support, these things are not carried out. That is really troubling.
There's a 4-letter word called time.
I thought you were going to say another word.
No. So there's a 4-letter word called time. And some of these things take time. I'm sure your audience understands that. So the only assurance I can give you is that none of these issues are off the hot plate. They are all being cooked up in one way or another. My wife hasn't given me the set of spices that I actually require at this stage, but sooner rather than later, we'll find some solutions to them.
The problem with time
See, they support me, not you.
The problem with time is that things can happen in between. So, for example, you've said on the nuclear build program that nothing will be done that's not affordable. But
Nothing has been done that's not affordable.
But is there not the possibility that we'll wake up one day and we'll be shocked to discover that there was not Treasury approval, and yet that things have happened behind the scenes, there were contracts signed, there were commitments made, like was what happened with Denel?
No, Denel is still a matter under discussion, so the less said about it, the better. But keep reading what you're reading. I mean, even the president has said in his pronouncements that the nuclear venture is an expensive one. It's very much part of the energy mix that we have transparently embraced in the integrated resource plan that we have in South Africa, and that money will only be spent on the basis of money that you have. Now, there are all sorts of preparatory processes, like developing a request for proposal, putting it out, seeing what kind of responses you get, testing the market, see who is offering what technology at what cost over what period of time, because these big projects are easy to sort of map out at a particular point in time, but invariably they can cost more and take longer to implement. Medupi is a classic example for us from which we must learn lessons. And so you've got to break this thing up into, let's call it eatable slices, before we can talk about executing the whole of the project. So no money has been spent on procuring nuclear. Money has been spent in setting up a team in the Department of Energy, to the best of my knowledge, in preparing documentation. And you as the public must hold us accountable and ask us, what progress are you making? What will you do when? And are you going to keep to your promise? So from my side, I'm saying that's a commitment we made, and that's a commitment we'll keep. The day we can't, we'll come back and transparently tell you.
So we already over our time, but
Thank you.
No. I
okay.
Obviously I'm going to pull a burning in Hlemeza on you and just ask you more questions that you may or may not be able to answer.
I answered the 27 questions, just for the record.
So on that issue, there has been statements from the NPA and from the Hawks that you will not be arrested as yet, and that if an arrest is to be made, you will be given notice. That's hardly a commitment not to arrest you. And I'm really happy that you're smiling about it, but I would imagine it must be quite distressing, and you said so in a statement that you issued, that to hear these stories about your possible arrest. There's been some time past now where you can process it, but I would imagine that this is still a difficult issue for you to navigate, that there is this ongoing investigation.
Yeah, no, that's one of the odd things. I think you addressed that to an earlier speaker here today.
Yes, Dr.
Well.
Mkhize called it an irritation.
Okay.
Yeah.
It can be an irritant. But let me tell you one thing, and that is that neither myself or many of the people who are accused of all sorts of things have ever stolen 1 cent of public money. So when you find yourself in that sort of, sorry, I'm a bit emotional.
Let's move on to another issue. We'll come back to this.
So you have nothing to hide and nothing to worry about.
Okay,
and if they want to do anything, well, let's suppose we have good courts in South Africa.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to an issue quickly that may make you angry instead.
No, I'm a fairly calm guy. So
So you've been requested by a group of former directors general to institute an investigation into state capture with particular reference to the influence of the Gupta family. We haven't heard from you whether you are in fact considering this.
now we've received, as has Minister Ramatlodi, a memo from these former directors general, and as soon as I get a gap in the diary, I will meet with them and inquire into what they really have in mind. I don't think we have the mandate to do some of these things. We might be in a position where we look at particular things that are happening that affect the state as far as the Public Finance Management Act or the Municipal Finance Management Act or the Constitution is concerned. But let us meet with them, understand what their concerns are. We would all, as South Africans, share the concern that we don't want any abuse of public money on the one hand, and nor do we want improper influence over any process or element of the state. So that's why I said earlier on very clearly that we require a coalition of leaders in government, outside of government, in civil society, and broadly amongst as many organizations as possible to reinstill the right values in our young people and in our society. Often the mistake we make is that we think government is the source of all good or also all the problems. We forget that corruption is a two-sided activity. It involves the state on occasions, but as you've seen from the construction saga around the World Cup stadia, or the bread saga, or many other cases that come to the Competition Commission, amongst other institutions, we also, in the very nature of capitalism, will have the private sector that oversteps the mark from time to time. But if we build the right ethical base in society and teach those values both to current generations and future generations, then you're building a more solid platform which will ensure that there's less risk of some of the things that we are talking about embedding themselves in a structural sense in the way, inverted commas, we do business in South Africa. And I'm sure all of you agree that we want to do business differently in South Africa.
Minister, many people look to you as our guardian, and with particular reference to
Not old
this
enough
issue.
for that yet, eh? Okay.
But I think that there would be concerns as to how can these allegations of state capture, of illicit influence and interference by private individuals, how can that occur in a state like ours, in a democratic state with, there should be safeguards that prevent that. And do these exist? I mean, if they exist, how are these things still happening?
Now, I'm sure there are many people in this audience and elsewhere who are familiar with the concept of rent seeking, who will know from their readings that economic systems of different types over many, many millennia have actually produced one or other kind of rent seeking in different types of societies and in different economies. I had the opportunity to meet a fairly senior business person from another country recently. And he was describing a point in the history of that country, let's say 10 years ago, where in the capital, he says, there was a cocktail circuit, where ministers and business people used to mix. And he described in fairly interesting terms how a business person could approach a minister or a senior bureaucrat and say, by the way, you're looking at this policy, can't you shape it in this way? The next time you are looking at this legislation, can't you put in these provisions? And the next time, the whole of the legislation, here's a copy, you might want to actually put this through your parliament. And it goes on. So these are phenomena that are not unique to us. They happen as part of the economic system. The lobbyists that operate on Capitol Hill in the United States, on the one hand, we are very gratified. It's a very transparent process. On the other hand, that's corruption, just given a sophisticated name called lobbying. That's all. These PACs that are created for candidates who are either going for nomination of a political party or later contesting an election, as they will be in November. They clearly are designed to not only just win favor, but shape policies in a particular way. Many of you will remember the Frank-Dodds Act, which Barney Frank and company put through immediately after the recession, that placed all sorts of constraints on, inverted commas, Wall Street, and in particular bankers. No sooner had the balances in the US Senate changed, one of the first targets was to go after a process that would dilute the impact of the act and the kind of new regulatory provisions that it had actually created. So each society and each economy and each of the role players in that society will have to look at what kind of culture do we want? What kind of business culture do we want to create? Do you want every traffic cop to be able to stop any one of us and any time in the day say, give me a bribe or else? Do you want every civil servant, before you get the service that you are legitimately entitled to as a citizen of this country, to say, give me a brown envelope before I give you X? What is happening in some instances is where, unless the brown envelope comes along, you won't get paid as a small business person within the 30-day period, although we've made huge progress in that area over the last few years as well. So these are choices that a society makes. And let me just reiterate what I said. You don't just sit on our backsides and say, we are going to now get this clean, ethical, moral world around us passively. We'll have to actively campaign for instituting the right kind of values, the right kind of behaviors, and that then becomes an institution in society. And that institution is the one that we want to outlive, all of us, and become part of what we will eventually call the South African way of doing business.
Minister, on that high note, I'm told that we're way over time, but I just wanted to ask you quickly in 20 seconds. Earlier this morning, we had Mr. Malema, Mr. Maimane, and Dr. Mkhize here, and you know, there is a lot of support for you, even from the opposition parties, particularly from the opposition parties, it seems. There is
I'm not crossing the floor at any stage.
Mr. Malema was talking about a kind of social consensus on the economy and people working together. Do you think that's possible,
yes,
considering the hostility there is in our politics?
Well, as I said, we require mature leadership from all sections of society that understands what it means to put national interests first, as opposed to personal, party political, or sectarian interests. And if we are able to cross that barrier and achieve that kind of consolidation of views on the critical questions that we face as a country, we have far greater prospects to bring about the kind of structural and meaningful changes in our society and in our economy that will really put us into a different kind of epoch in our history. And yes, it is possible, and more importantly, it is necessary for us to do that.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here, and I hand you back to John.
Thank you very much.